On March 19th, 1860, William Jennings Bryan was born in Salem, Illinois to Maria and Silas Lillard Bryan, being the fourth of 9 kids. However, only 5 of them ended up living to adulthood. The Bryan household was very political and religious-oriented, which influenced William heavy growing up, using it as a way to get very good at giving speeches. Due to his upbringing, he had very few career choices that he wanted to pursue, and decided to go into law. While in college, he met Mary Elizabeth Bayard and began a relationship, getting married in 1884. After graduating, he worked at a local law firm before moving to Nebraska, seeing better opportunities there, setting up a small legal practice with a fellow alumni of his school. He ended up becoming well known for his legal speeches, which was an easy forte into politics, running for Congress in Nebraska's 1st District, beating the incumbent Republican due to his debate skills. Despite him being a freshman, he was able to earn a spot on the House Ways and Means Committee, and he sought to use his platform to raise issues that he was passionate about. At the time, a rift within the Democratic Party between the conservative Bourbon Democrats and the Populists was beginning to pick up momentum in regards to the issue of free silver versus hard gold-backed currency. Bryan was in favor of free silver, which was also being represented by a separate political party called the People's Party. The rift on the issue pushed Bryan into the arms of the latter group, splitting him from the establishment-oriented Bourbon Dems, so much so that he supported their nominee over Grover Cleveland. After Cleveland won, he started pushing for more conservative reforms, including repealing a law that stated that the government had to buy a certain amount of silver each month. While the bill failed, Bryan was able to put an amendment pushing for the first peacetime income tax. After the effects of the Panic of 1893 became evident, many more voters were pushed into the arms of the People's Party and their ideas of bimetallism, and rather than seeking re-election, Bryan decided to translate the momentum into running for the Nebraska Senate election, offering himself as a Democratic People's Coalition candidate. While that momentum didn't pan out, he was able to use his skills to beat the conservative wing of the party and elect a populist-minded Democrat to the governorship. After leaving office, he decided to go on a nationwide speaking tour to talk about the issue of free silver. While primarily focusing on the issue itself, another idea was brewing in Bryan's head that wouldn't become apparent until 1896. As the next presidential election was approaching, it was the prime opportunity to try and officially see how much power this free silver faction had within the party. The silver faction's plans for this was to put as many of their names into contention into the presidential nomination process, one of which included Bryan. Now you might say, how can all of these presidential candidates running in the same cycle do anything but benefit the conservative Democrats? You see, the plan was each of the people who put their names into contention to have a slot in order to give a speech, and the plan was that a bunch of them would simply drop out and endorse whichever one was the most popular. And since Bryan was already well known for giving great speeches, he knew that he would be a great assist to the bimetalist faction, knowing that he probably didn't really have a chance to win. However, there was a lot of infighting, not just between the silver and gold factions, but also in between the factions as well. So it was hard to not only find a torchbearer for each side, but also hard to find out a person who could unify all the factions, which of course gave Bryan some worry. So on day 3 of the convention, Bryan was slated to give his speech. A speech that had very big ambitions as he sought to try and unify the whole Democratic Party behind bimetallism. He spoke for 35 minutes, giving a speech that would become known as the Cross of Gold speech.
We will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold.
After he concluded his speech, he thought he failed, as the entire convention was dead silent. Walking off the stage in defeat, he then heard the entire crowd roar up in cheers. A bunch of them even ran up to the stage and grabbed Bryan and held him on their shoulders. If you need more evidence it worked, here's the delegates before the speech, and here's the delegates after the speech. So yeah, in a massive upset, Bryan, a random congressman from Nebraska, became the Democratic nominee for president. And Bryan wanted to change how things would go. Remember how I said his speech was intended to unify the entire Democratic Party? Well, actually, that was a bit of an understatement, as he tried to unite all factions of bimetallist groups, which included the People's Party, the Silver Party, and the Silver Republicans. As the name implies, these were people who were Republicans who left to create a new political party to support free silver. And while there were a lot of people joining Bryan's coalition, there were some people who were leaving, as some Democrats refused to have Bryan as their nominee, and they decided to run their own ticket. However, back to Bryan, another thing he wanted to change was how campaigning worked. You see, back in the day, it was originally seen as a taboo to actively campaign for president. The idea would be that you would humbly accept the nomination of other people who would campaign on your behalf. But as you can tell, Bryan didn't really roll that way, and he embarked on a national campaign tour, the first one that was not done in secret. He ended up giving 600 speeches and reached an audience of 5 million in 27 states. However, moneyed interests were a little too much for him to win. After the 1896 election, the issue of free silver was in the rearview mirror. However, the incoming Republican administration was starting to push the United States' influence around the world, and Bryan wasn't too happy about it, and had now solidly placed himself in the now growing anti-imperialist crowd, which was a prime opportunity for him to mount a second campaign for president. And while the Bourbons desperately tried to get someone to run against him, Bryan was just too popular and was unanimously chosen to be the nominee. After he got the nomination, there was a little bit of a debate amongst Bryan and his allies on what his campaign should be about, ultimately dividing into three camps. One, the hardcore populace, who wanted Bryan to remain focused on the free silver issue. Then there was a second group of the populace that wanted Bryan to shift his focus to more focus on antitrust legislation. And the last faction was Bryan, who wanted to stay focused on the imperialism issue. And ultimately, Bryan got his way. The last election made it apparent which William had which advantage. McKinley had the money advantage, but Bryan had the people advantage. So McKinley had to change things up, and nominated Teddy Roosevelt as his running mate. Roosevelt being a lot like Bryan in the sense that he liked going in a crowd and giving speeches. As such, while he remained on the front porch, Roosevelt would campaign on McKinley's behalf. And he did give Bryan a run for his money, even more so when Bryan learned the sad truth. While anti-imperialism was growing in the United States, it wasn't large enough to make it your central campaign theme. So basically at the last minute, he decided to change his mind and focus back on economic issues. But as I said, it was a little too late to make a difference. After Bryan's second loss, he decided that it was best for him to step back from running for office, deciding to start a weekly paper called The Commoner, where he would still commentate on current political issues. He talked about the GOP administrations, giving both praise and criticism to Teddy Roosevelt, arguing he's doing fine, but you need to drop that imperialist foreign policy and/or ramp up your domestic policy. Conservative Democrats saw the opportunity of his semi-retirement to take over the party from Bryan, but he still had a decent amount of control over it, so it was very difficult to do so. Even though he pledged not to run in 1904, there was a lingering fear that Bryan would endorse William Randolph Hearst against the Conservatives' torchbearer, Alton Parker, so the Conservative Democrats basically rewrote the party platform to be more conciliatory to Bryan in hopes that he wouldn't endorse him, which he didn't end up doing. And coincidentally, Alton Parker ended up losing by the largest margin since the Civil War, which Bryan saw as vindication, and he told his followers, "Do not compromise with the plutocracy." That, combined with Roosevelt not running for re-election in 1908, made Bryan decide to run for the presidency a third time. This campaign was noticeably different from the other two for a number of reasons. For starters, this was the first election where Bryan had to officially drop bimetallism, as the issue was 100% dead at this point. In this same vein, this would be the first time where Bryan would only run as a Democrat, as all of his other ballot lines had effectively vanished. There was still a People's Party out there, but they were less than a footnote in the discourse. The last major thing that was notable was Bryan was not the young, spry congressman from his first two runs. despite the fact that he still campaigned as if he was, which ended up leading Bryan to become visibly tired after giving a speech. And due to this, Bryan wasn't exactly as in as he used to be. He was now seen as a relic from an old era, trying to keep his issues alive. The GOP taking full advantage of this by saying, "Vote for Taft now, vote for Bryan anytime." While he was struggling to reestablish a base, Hearst came out with an expose that called out allies to both Taft and Bryan who were accepting political bribes. While Taft had cut ties with his corrupt political ally, Bryan never did, which in a way showed that he wasn't even in line with his party's own left wing anymore, which seemed to help with his loss. Afterwards, Bryan returned to his semi-retirement from electoral politics, but this time he vowed to make it permanent, denying any intentions to run for a fourth time. He tried to influence Democrats' platforms as they started getting control again, coming out in favor of prohibition and women's suffrage. However, all this started coming to a head in the next presidential election. As the GOP was dividing, Democrats saw an opportunity to snatch up the presidency once more. Bryan wanted to make sure that the person who snatched it up was not a member of the conservative wing. For practical reasons, he really only had two options: Woodrow Wilson and Champ Clark, both of whom were claiming to be progressives, but had some slight issues. At the convention, Bryan successfully pushed for the party to add a plank to their platform, stating they are opposed to the nomination of any candidate who is a representative of or under any obligation to J.P. Morgan, Thomas F. Ryan, August Belmont, or any other member of the privilege-hunting and favor-seeking class. After the first round, Clark ended up earning the nomination of Tammany Hall, and as such, Wilson earned Bryan's, and after Wilson won, Bryan got a nice new job as his Secretary of State. While at first they agreed on a lot, as the administration continued, Bryan and Wilson started butting heads. It all came to a head after the sinking of the Lusitania. Bryan tried to pressure Wilson to issue a warning telling Americans not to travel on British vessels. After Wilson refused and instead started a government protest against Germany, Bryan resigned from his position. After that, Bryan tried his best to make this retirement permanent, but it seemed he was still well liked because people kept dragging him back in. The Prohibition Party tried to draft him for their nomination, but refused in favor of supporting Wilson's re-election bid. While he had reservations, he still offered his support to the campaign and the war effort. Afterwards, he mostly focused on being an activist, pushing for prohibition, women's suffrage, an 8-hour workday, a living wage, etc. As much as people pushed him to try and run for president in 1920, he steered clear from that election, even refusing to campaign for James Cox, as he really just wanted to retire for good, moving to Florida with his wife. However, he did become a lot more active in religion, becoming one of the first to hold sermons over the radio. Bryan did end up returning to politics briefly during the 1924 election, joining with the debate on whether or not the Democratic Party should condemn the KKK. He argued that they shouldn't, but not for the reason that you may think. Bryan thought that the KKK would essentially disappear after 1924, so he felt that there was no need to campaign against a dying organization. What he did end up being more vocal on was attacking Al Smith, as Smith wasn't in favor of prohibition. While he hated the nomination of Davis for president, the fact that they nominated his brother Charles made him happy enough to offer his oratory skills to the campaign. But back to religion, Bryan spent the last years of his life trying to prevent public schools from teaching the theory of evolution, most prominently being the prosecuting lawyer in the Scopes trial, a trial that was essentially a proxy war between religious fundamentalists and everyone else. And a mere 5 days after the trial ended, Bryan passed away of apoplexy. Bryan, for lack of a better term, is an incredibly interesting political figure, and I'm actually surprised that he's not talked about a lot more, given the fact that the internet populism is sort of in, and Bryan is literally the figurehead of American populism, especially since, like some other populist figures, he technically has enough wiggle room to have support from people on the right and the left, though I believe people on the left would probably like him a whole lot more. It's weird that this fascination with Bryan happened after I was done with school, instead of when I was learning about him in school, but hey, we all learn at one point. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and click that bell to be notified when a future video of mine comes out. And if you see more content from me, you can go to my website, follow me on Twitter, join my Discord, check my articles at Independent Political Report, or consider supporting me on Patreon.